Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. If you have not listened to the previous episode on Reconstruction and the Constitution, please do, because it kind of sets us up for our conversation today and our next two conversations. So Dr. Beinberg is back with us, and today we're talking about the 13th and 15th Amendments, and we will do the 14th Amendments, but 13 and 15 today. So Dr. Beinberg, we've talked about Reconstruction and the Constitution. Why are the 13th and 15th Amendments so important? Because again, I know Reconstruction amendments are 13, 14, 15. What is it about the 13th and 15th Amendments in Reconstruction?
Yeah, so the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865. And as we've talked about before with the Emancipation Proclamation, right, that is a wartime measure, not a general power of the federal government. And so there is a concern that the 13th Amendment is necessary, in case the argument is that, well, you have to give confiscated property back at the end of a war often. So is that going to be applied to the slaves that were freed under the 13th Amendment? And B, again, as we talked about with the Emancipation Proclamation 1, the Emancipation Proclamation is geographically limited. It only applies basically two places where there is still basically Southern control. At the end of the war, there is no more Southern control. Well, there's little tiny pockets, but basically war is over, right? And so the 13th Amendment is designed to eliminate both the geographic and the temporal constraints of America's effort to end slavery. And so it makes it federal policy. Note strikingly, this is not simply a new federal power. Congress shall have the authority to end slavery, right? It says slavery is banned. It doesn't have a state action list limit. So it's not slavery shall not be operated by, the state government or a federal government or anything like that. Like the 14th Amendment has some state action restrictions. It just says it's banned. This is the policy. This applies to private. This applies to government. Now, strikingly, it uses the final version they go with uses almost verbatim the language of the Northwest Ordinance, which in itself, as we talked about before, been drafted earlier by Thomas Jefferson in a failed bill in the 1780s. And this is kind of striking because Lincoln's speeches often call back to the Northwest Ordinance as a really important moment of American policy, and his effort, again, I think correctly, to say folks that want to limit slavery's expansion in the territories are not the new fanatics. Like that had been the old, he even says in the Cooper Union speech, like this is the conservative policy. This is what we've done for decades. You guys are the ones that are calling for a change. And so it's I think notable that the Northwest Ordinance ends up being the text here, reinforcing Lincoln's argument this had been a really foundational thing. And so this sort of bleeds into the 14th Amendment a little bit. So I'll do this part short, but they're trying to figure out sort of, okay, so slavery is banned. What does that mean is banned? Does literally like whipping somebody unless they work in your field? Does that include sort of all of the additional kind of racial politics that goes attached to it? They call badges and incidents or badges and emblems is language that gets used later. And so pretty quickly, most folks tend to recognize the 13th Amendment is pretty narrow. And so that's part of what the 14th Amendment is needed for. So again, we'll talk more about the 14th Amendment in a subsequent podcast, but that's basically what the 13th Amendment is supposed to do. Jumping ahead a little bit then to the 15th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment has a first crack, basically, in efforts to make sure that states don't have racially inegalitarian voting. There's a section in there that basically says if you make it so like black men can't vote, then your percentage of voting goes down by however your percentage of like black men is. It's a clever inversion of like the 3/5 clause kind of a thing, which is like if you'd like to be racist, you can, you're just have basically no control over Congress anymore. And then they decide very quickly, like, nope, that was a mistake. Let's put some real teeth into this. And so they pass the 15th Amendment, which in 1870. And this, it's always worth looking at the text here. And so the language of the 15th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, one thing that's striking is it is written in the negative formulation, right? It doesn't say there is an affirmative right to vote. It says whatever right to vote exists can't be denied on these grounds, which is the formulation that gets used in the late, like the 19th Amendment uses the same formulation, the 26th Amendment and college age suffrage, right? So, and that's important because there's a debate very quickly in constitutional stuff of, do these kinds of laws let the federal government take a direct and primary action in regulating this? Or do you have to have evidence that the state has failed to provide whatever this thing is first, or the state has actively denied it? The text of the 15th Amendment seemingly looks like it's also written in that negative formulation, like the 14th. But if you look at the speeches and the legislative history and the Frederick Douglass thing we'll talk about in a second, it looks pretty clear that Congress expected this to be much more robust, where Congress could take more of a primary actor element than demonstrating evidence of state failure. So, and the theory behind the 15th Amendment by many of the folks in Congress, and Frederick Douglass articulates this in this Atlantic speech, or excuse me, a letter, like an op-ed, I guess, that he submits to the Atlantic discussing Reconstruction. And he says, look, Americans everywhere, regardless of ideology or region, they still care about federalism. Again, part of why I was ranting about the lost cause last time, right? It's not about getting rid of federalism. He says, we still care about federalism. But what can we do to make sure that the South doesn't restart the Civil War and that Black rights are protected? And so Douglass says the best way to do that would be to make sure that suffrage is racially neutral. And so therefore, Black Americans, at this point, Black men, because there's no 19th Amendment, and the states certainly haven't done this yet. Let's let Black men basically protect their rights and their civil liberties through the ballot box in the South. So and Congress basically this is the same model. And so the idea is that if Congress intervenes, again, fairly aggressively in this one domain, let's make sure that suffrage is racially neutral among citizens. We don't have to micromanage Reconstruction, right? So the thought is, in some sense, we don't have to put soldiers everywhere if basically Black Southerners can vote to have law enforcement in the South protect their rights. And so enforcing voting, they say, this is one and easy. It doesn't create any sweeping, massive federal power, certainly if we draw it up the way that they do that. So let's intervene here. So that's kind of the political theory behind the 15th Amendment. But they also put some teeth in there, and so they pass what's called the Enforcement Acts, but they usually get called the Klan Acts. And this is part of why I think your colleague Jeff Davis and I have talked about this, that Ulysses S. Grant is wildly underrated as a president, partly because those lost causers basically libel him as an idiot and a corrupt and a drunk, because they don't like the fact that he completely thrashes the Ku Klux Klan into non-existence in the early 1870s, just utterly breaks the first Ku Klux Klan as an enforcement of the 15th Amendment, because the main thing that it's trying to do is basically terrorize Black Southerners and white Southern allies out of voting. So the 15th Amendment says states can't do that kind of stuff, and we will make sure that that gets suppressed. So, and the Supreme Court, again, is pretty okay with this. Case in 1884 called Ex parte Yarborough. They uphold pretty robust enforcement of the 15th Amendment. So then the question is what happens? Why does the 15th Amendment become inert for decades? Well, I think we're going to do a separate podcast on an event called the Lodge Bill in 1890, which is sort of the last hurrah of Reconstruction. But it's not the Supreme Court that kills this off. It's Congress. Again, we talked before that sort of Northern Republican voters are tired. Northern voters are tiring of Reconstruction. Southern Democratic politicians, even those from the North that may themselves be sort of skeptical of racial hierarchy stuff in their own state politics, even they might even be pushing it literally as policy in the North. They have an incentive because of party coalitions to see basically white supremacy in the South in terms of its voting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they either don't want to do it or they turn a blind eye to it. So Grover Cleveland, for example, in 1884, when he gets elected, he and his allies in Congress basically start paring out chunks of civil rights enforcement. We'll talk more about this with the 14th Amendment, but they don't modify the Civil Rights Act. They could have fixed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 very easily, but they don't want to. And in 1894, right as they're getting ready to get thrashed, largely for economic issues, they pretty much remove almost all of the federal enforcement. It hadn't been really aggressively enforced while Cleveland is president, but it gets yanked out of the statutes. And so the 15th Amendment gets defunct and openly defunct. I mean, it's one of the things that was most striking to me when I was doing a bunch of research in this era is there are members of Congress and state legislators that say it's a good thing the 14th and 15th Amendments are dead. Like they were illegitimately imposed on us by war. And like, we're glad they're not. Like there's not even a like, well, we're squinting it hard and we're following the letter. Like they are openly admitting our goal is to have it dead. And our goal in some cases is to straight up repeal it so that theory can match reality. So you do have a couple of moments when the 15th Amendment seems like it might be poking back up. In 1915, the Supreme Court unanimously in a case called Guinn versus U.S. strikes down the so-called grandfather clauses, which basically we're going to say, well, anyone whose grandfathers could vote, which was a way to basically create, they could set some really obscene, difficult, impossible literary tests that no one could pass. And then basically say, but if your grandpa could vote, they could. And it's worth noting that the text of the 15th Amendment, for example, they didn't put literacy test bans in there precisely because Northerners wanted to continue maintaining literacy tests. They just wanted to say, but they have to be racially neutral, right? If you want to make it so only like, I guess, Harvard PhDs can vote, that's not inconsistent with the 15th Amendment. So that, again, there was not a ban per se on those precisely because Northerners were happy having those kinds of policies. So Guinn basically says, like, whatever you're going to do on that, you actually have to have racial neutrality if you're going to do that. But they strike the grandfather clauses down. And then a character who doesn't often get much of a nod, Warren Harding, gives a speech shortly before he dies. He goes to the South in Birmingham, and he gives a long talk on basically race relations in America. And he doesn't spend that much time. It's only like 3 or 4 sentences on voting. But he basically says, yeah, you guys need to have black men voting. And he says, not every black American needs to vote and not every white American needs to vote. But whatever your rule is, you need to have it equally enforced. And then he moves on. I've seen some historians argue that like Harding actually was, that's like whole counterfactual. Had Harding lived, like, would we have seen the 1960s and the 1920s? Not so convinced, but it is that's a striking moment compared to what, say, Theodore Roosevelt or others had been doing, which was sort of basically abetting the lost causers almost. Harding wants to say, like, no, this was actually about race. But Harding obviously dies. Coolidge will continue to protest lynching and want Congress to pass a 14th Amendment enforcement. But basically, the 15th Amendment goes defunct again until a couple of court cases. And then obviously, most famously, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which I think we're going, in fact, probably do a whole section on that or split with the Civil Rights Act or something. So I'm not going to go into the arcana of that. But the Voting Rights Act at its core, at least in 1965, is an enforcement of the 15th Amendment and sort of racially staggered, or an attack on basically racially, arbitrary suffrage rules. Later revisions and some of the extra pieces will add on like the language stuff. But at the core of it, the Voting Rights Act in 65 is an enforcement, including with some pretty tough sort of temporary emergency provisions to finally enforce the 15th Amendment.
It's so interesting because we talk about the 15th Amendment. And it's, generally well known as like, oh, that gave Black men the right to vote. And Black women didn't have the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 with Indigenous women. But it's an interesting thing to hear you talk about, like how it was essentially defunct. Like it's still in the Constitution.
Yeah.
It doesn't go away. But when you're talking about like the grandfather clause and literacy test, if you have not looked up a literacy test, please do so, because I used to give them to my students and they were absolutely baffled that these were actual things that were utilized. There's so many things that try to continually disenfranchise, groups of people, even though, again, 15th Amendment has been there, since Reconstruction, but the level of enforcement has changed throughout history.
Yeah, I mean that's there. One could impishly suggest that it's not the only part of the Constitution that has been defunct over American history, but that's a side conversation perhaps. But yeah, it is quite striking, and how openly it was dismissed. Yeah, so that it is. Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk more about the Voting Rights Act in another way.
And then for the 13th Amendment, I did want to ask a question, because the part of it in Section 1 that says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, that kind of leads to mass incarceration, because there were, a lot of former enslaved persons who then were charged for crimes and made to, were sent to prison, made to work land to kind of work off, these supposed crimes. I mean, again, that's probably an entirely separate podcast, but it's the wording of these amendments to me is always very interesting, and how they're kind of picked apart and used in certain parts of American history.
Yeah, I mean the mass incarceration piece is one that's got a lot of sort of scholarship picking at it in both ways, but that is partly why, to make sure that there's no ambiguity on that, is why several of the states that have 13th Amendment language in there have gone through in the last few years and pulled that piece actually out, because of the concern that you just raised, which was, what was this, and or could this be a tool for that? So that's something that the state governments have certainly been concerned about of late.
That's very interesting. All right, Dr. Weinberg, I am looking forward to talking about the 14th Amendment. Sorry, always being so. What are you doing? What are you doing? Just trying to dig a hole to China in our carpet. Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. I am looking forward to our conversation on the 14th Amendment in 2 parts coming up in our next couple episodes.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.